Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in a documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller. I'm the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust Theater Project, thinedgeofthewedge.com. My grandparents came from Latvia and Russia at the turn of the last century. But my husband and I, he was a US Army officer, we were stationed in Munich, Germany in September 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II.
And did you want me to introduce myself?
I'll introduce you first and then. Okay, so we are thrilled to have on our show today Dr. Orli Peter. Orli is a clinical and neuropsychologist in Los Angeles. She's a therapist, researcher, and educator. Trauma is one of her specialties, and she treats many refugees and survivors of terror attacks. In addition to her scientific publications, she wrote columns in national newspapers and magazines. Orli has taken various initiatives against anti-Semitism, and she was on the board of the Daniel Pearl Foundation. Like me, Orli is a daughter of Holocaust survivors. Orli, thank you for coming on our show. Welcome, and we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to ask the first question.
Okay.
Can you tell us about your family's experiences in the Holocaust, and particularly the amazing story of when your father and his parents had to make a life or death in the real sense of the word?
Yes, sure. So my father was a Holocaust survivor. My mother was an American. So I got the experience of both worlds. But my father was 11 years old when Hitler invaded Poland. And he was forced into the ghetto soon after that and lived as a slave, of course, in squalor. He and my grandmother, my grandfather, my uncle, many of his cousins, his aunts, his uncle were all corralled into the ghetto and turned into slaves.
Which ghetto?
And this was in the Lodz ghetto. And they were, they lived in a room. They were forced in a room. That's where they slept, and they had no toilet. And then aside from sleeping, my father first was a slave in a factory. And so he grew up like that. And after a while, of course, on his way from where he was, where the slaves slept, to the factories, he never knew, this is what he told me, that he never knew when he would walk outside which dead bodies he'd be stepping over, whether this time it would be a friend or a family member. And growing up like that, he had decided that if he was going to die, he was going to die with integrity, not begging. And he was just going to die as, a man. This is, so when he was 17, and he's walking outside and the Gestapo came by, and most of the Jews knew that when the Gestapo comes by, you never knew if they would just for target practice, just shoot whatever Jew they would see on the street. So they would duck and hide. But my father decided he was going to keep walking. And they were so shocked that they stopped the car and they said, "Jew, get in the car." And he said, "Fine." And he got in the car, and my grandmother, who's hiding, is screaming this is the last time she's ever going to see her son. And they drive away with him. And in the car, the Nazi turns to my father in the back seat and says, "We are going to transfer everybody to a better place, a better ghetto. You won't have to work as hard and there'll be more food. Tell all the Jews that. And then he elbowed the Polish driver next to him and said, isn't that right? Isn't that right? And my father looked in his eyes. This was a crucial moment. He looked in his eyes and he determined that those were the eyes of a murderer and he wasn't going to believe anything he said. So they dropped him out of the car and they said, go and tell everybody. And he went back to his mother and his brother. His father had already been tortured and murdered by the Nazis, so he was already gone, and said, we're not going to go. And the Nazis, there were 250,000 Jews in Lodz before the war, but the Nazis had wanted 700 to stay in the ghetto and clean up. And my father said, we're going to stay. And his brother said, no, we're going to leave. Because of course, in that kind of desperation, you can't imagine it could be worse. And most of the people wanted to go. In fact, we're excited to go. And there's a scene that was described to me at the trains, which we later knew were the trains going to Auschwitz. They're going to be murdered immediately. My uncle, my father's brother, is putting their belongings onto the train, and my father's taking it off, and his brother's putting it on, and my father's taking it off, and my grandmother throws her arms up and says, Ribbono shel olam, what shall I do? One son wants to leave, the other wants to stay. And at that moment, somebody walked by who they didn't know, and he said, Madam, if you ask me, you should stay. And she said, that's it. An angel spoke to me, we're staying. And they stayed behind and they helped clean up, which of course was really getting rid of the evidence, we know now. And then at a point where they had the remaining 700 Jews build these big long ditches, my father and some other friends had decided these ditches were meant for them. They were going to then murder everybody because they could see that most of the cleaning up had already been done. And they said, if there's any chance, like, we've got to hide. We can't, like, even if we can delay our lives, you know, our murder just a few days, we got to hide. So they hid, they and a few other families hid in a hole. And after a few days, they were starving and thirsty, and they drew straws to see who should go and get some food and water, go back into the kitchen. And my father lost. And so as he's leaving to go and, you know, search for food and water, again, my grandmother's screaming, that's it, I'm never going to see my son again. And he goes and he sees, you know, he's like, you know, he's sneaking around and he sees a Jew, this is at night, walking through the kitchen. And he said, oh my God. And he knew the person. And he said, oh my God, that traitor. Like, how can he walk freely through the kitchen? He's a traitor. And the Jew sees him and says, what are you hiding for? Get out of there. The Russians have come. We're liberated. Go back, tell everybody. And so that's how my father learned that they were liberated and went back and told everybody. So that's how they survived, through a moment of intuition. First a moment of kind of defiance and integrity, and then a moment of intuition.
And an angel.
Maybe an angel.
So how does this family history affect you today? And how do you see yourself as different than Jews who live in America who have no relatives connected to the Holocaust, who, like my grandparents, you know, came 100 and something years ago to the United States? How does that set you apart? And what does it teach you about life that you need to do, or that we all need to do?
Yeah, so I never felt deeply connected to American Jews who didn't have this kind of background. They always, first of all, they were wealthier. We had lost any Obviously the Jews were robbed and pillaged and et cetera. And so my father had to start with nothing. And he also had no education because he was in the ghetto the whole time. So he was obsessed with education, and I never saw him. He was working and going to school to make up for it. So for one, he was very rarely around. But when he was around, you could feel the rage and the absolute horror. You could feel as if his guts were just, twisted. And there were different reactions that the Holocaust survivors had. He was one of the ones who was silent. He couldn't speak about it, but we would hear stories through my mother. And occasionally, if a relative, the very few relatives we had left, because it was only on my father's side, his brother and his mother who survived, the scores of other people were murdered or, died of starvation or disease in the camps and ghetto. So we would just occasionally hear what we could feel every single moment. We would hear like a little description, a little story here and there. And one of the things that we knew was that just like what's happening today, the anti-Semitism was increasing in Poland, and the Jews were concerned, and they didn't know what to do. And my grandmother decided that this was before the war, that she was going to go to British Mandate Palestine and buy property, which she did. And she came back and she said, now we'll have a place to go if things get really bad. Well, what I was told was 2 weeks later, Hitler invaded, and soon after the borders were closed. So they didn't get out in time. And even so, most of my father's friends were kind of rationalizing, it's not going to be that bad. England won't let this happen. Whatever Hitler's saying, it can't be that, because it's just beyond the imagination of most people, and especially most good people, to conceive of something like that. And that made them easier targets. So we had known this, and for us and other people whose parents were Holocaust survivors, you could tell me this was true for you too, Evelyn, that we always were feeling like at any moment things could change quickly. And so we didn't have the same kind of security inside that other American Jews had. And now, of course, we understand the neurobiology of that too. It's not just the stories. So they weren't triggered anytime there would be a disturbance in some sort of geopolitical, field, some sort of safety. They weren't as alerted as we would be. We would be like, so that's the kind of fundamental difference. Even down to the nitty gritty, when my father was around, I remember if we would laugh and giggle, he would get upset and he'd say, life is serious. So there was this kind of, very different world when my father would be home, which wasn't that often, again, because he was going to school full time and studying full time. And then my mother, who was this kind of free hippie American before the hippies existed, she had that kind of personality. So we got both worlds, and I could understand both worlds, but I could never, I was in a sense marked in terms of just believing in the carefree world. Marked is in a good way, that I knew that evil existed and that you have to be alert.
Evelyn, it's your turn to ask questions.
Orli, you mentioned that we now know the biological factor in being alert if you have a history of being threatened. I would love to talk more about that in maybe another time when we invite you back, if we may. But now I would like to switch to more to the present, the anti-Semitism today, and how we react to that and how to react to that. You once wrote a blog post in the Huffington Post saying that was titled Fight, Flight, or Tend and Befriend. And it describes how people tend to shame each other for feeling fear, but that fear actually is a useful survival mechanism. It puts us in the optimal mode, physiological mode, to fight, flee, or appease the threat. Do you feel fear about the current anti-Semitism?
Oh, yes, I do. I think, you know, when I wrote that post, it was during a time which still exists today. There's still factions that still in the mental health profession that still operate as if all negative feelings are bad, and fear is a negative feeling and it's bad. And it's a very self-serving philosophy that it feels bad. We don't want to feel bad, so we're going to meditate and feel good. And so we want to get rid of these feelings. And so the post was about, the blog that I wrote was about that these feelings have value. They were passed on evolutionarily from our ancestors because they have value. In fact, much of our brain is designed for survival and to notice threats. And the way that we notice threats is through one of the pathways, but the best pathway is through fear. And of course, fear can be too much or it can be too little, you know, and you might say the Goldilocks approach is to notice it, to feel it, and then to operate on it. And the blog was about how, you know, some people kind of have an arrogance of the way that they manage the fear, especially if they're able to ward it off in some way. And if you just ward it off, then you're not getting the information that is being sent to you that there's a threat and that you need to do something. So it was kind of looking at, in a playful way, the different types of psychological research that was coming out, which we can talk about at another time if you want, about fear.
But do you feel fear now?
Yes.
For what?
Yeah. Well, the anti-Semitism is growing. I mean, obviously, I'm not panicked, but the anti-Semitism is growing. It's a threat. I'm in Los Angeles, and I live in a Jewish community. And during the Gaza war, that was an excuse for people to come out and start beating up Jews in my community, putting hateful anti-Semitic messages on the synagogues around here. And on social media, you could see the, you know, the surge of anti-Semitism that kind of erupted during the Gaza war and kind of still remains in a latent form, ready to erupt again.
And what could that lead to?
Well, I mean, of course, the ultimate that it could lead to is death, especially the dehumanization that's going on in some of the extreme quarters in the right wing and in the extreme left wing, the extreme right wing and the extreme left wing, to dehumanize Jews, you know, or just the opposite, to suprahumanize them, that the Jews have these superhuman, you know, traits that control the world and control the press and, all of this nonsense, which I might add, we're doing such a terrible job of controlling the press. But in all seriousness, these kind of superhuman traits kind of are very useful during the time of, the pandemic and the financial pressures that people are under. This is the time when anti-Semitism surges. It's tremendous fodder, especially for anti-Semitism, because, the tropes are that we're superhuman in some way and we're behind this and we control this. So if we just eliminate the Jew, then things will get better.
Yes, that's what you once told me. What I learned from you is that the racism towards other minorities is usually in such a way that they are seen as less good as the others and less capable as the others, inferior to others, whereas anti-Semitism is unique, I think you said. It says Jews are much better at everything.
Yes.
So that's much more threatening. I thought it was an important insight. So, okay, you say there is you feel fear today.
And yeah, go ahead.
So you said you do feel fear today, and you think it's not just a neurotic reaction to the past. It is real. It's based on reality, and it's therefore it's fear for something, for a real threat. Do Americans, Jews in general, you feel enough fear for the situation today, or not enough, or too much?
Well, I mean,
Can I say something here? I think
yeah.
it is saying here is, are Jews in America, rather than American Jews, but Jews in America, not taking anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism, seriously enough? And how do we get to them and get them to understand that they need to take it seriously and they need to push back by education, not by yelling? I think that's kind of what we're looking for as we get near to the end of this podcast. What can our listeners do against this rising anti-Semitism?
Well, that's a lot of questions, but I think, as we all know, if you have, 2 Jews in a town, you have 3 synagogues. So it's kind of hard to generalize about Jews. But I think that there are a significant number of Jews in America who are not taking it seriously enough, because they grew up in an America where the anti-Semitism really uniquely throughout history was very minimal. And it's hard, for an old dog to learn new tricks, And so they still believe, even though it's increasing now, the defenses are, well, it's because of the Gaza war, or it's because the Jews, whatever, there's all kinds of rationalizations. So they're not able to notice it well enough. And, as I've said before, these things can happen very fast. And you've got right now the fodder that's there and the nutrients in our political soil for it to burst again. And so no, I don't think for the most part it's being taken seriously enough. And for some of the people who do take it more serious, what I'm seeing with my friends and people that I come in contact with, they're hoping they can just duck or ride it out. And so they don't have the necessary courage, many of them, to actually speak out or speak back. Because one thing about being a Jew is some Jews can hide. Not all, but some Jews can hide. And of course, if you can hide, it makes sense evolutionarily again. I mean, we know again with the way the brain works to hide. But in the long run, it's actually going to weaken us.
That's interesting. At the one hand, they don't take it seriously enough, and on the other hand, they take it seriously enough to hide and
Yeah.
not to speak up against it. That's
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
scientific.
I want to add that I think, you know, right now with the growing viewpoint, especially among many of the youth, you know, and seeing the world only in power dynamics as oppressor and oppressed, and everything's kind of funneled through those narrow lens. That the Jews are, especially since this is a lot of the lens that people are seeing things through, the Jews with the type of, you know, we had already talked about the type of that anti-Semitism is unique in that it's the Jew is the controller and the superhuman. That makes us, by definition, the oppressor. And when you have a lens like that, it's going to be harder to see the anti-Semitism because we're the oppressors, not the oppressed. So it kind of blinds many people to the fact that the Jews have the number one, you know, hate crimes against them in New York, and even across the country. In New York, number one hate crimes, even including, you know, race, religion, sexuality, all of that. And in the country, number one hate crime, you know, among any of the religions. And I think it's even increased even more this last year. I haven't recently checked the data, but I think it's gone up quite a bit. It's quite a surge. So we're in danger.
Yeah. Okay. What do you advise the Jews in America to do? To fight against the current anti-Semitism, to flee it, or to neutralize it through dialogue and education of potential perpetrators or even proven perpetrators?
Well, I think, you know, most Jews have heard the story that you always have a suitcase pact. And I think it's really important to fight it, because at some point, especially with globalization, where do you flee to? There's less and less places to flee. So ultimately, it has to be fought, but maybe have a suitcase, you know, packed in your closet while you're fighting.
I just read about anti-Semitism in Germany, in which someone is quoted as saying, well, you don't have to take it upstairs yet from the basement, but you should maybe make sure it's there and it's ready to go. And I thought,
Yeah.
And I will just say that because my husband and I lived in Germany so soon after World War II, when we came back to the United States, and had children, we got them passports immediately, like as soon as they were like a couple months old, but not with us, by themselves, so they could be taken out of the country by anyone. And that was totally influenced by having lived in Europe so soon after World War II, as opposed to being American Jews who grew up in communities without Holocaust survivors. So I think the warning about this suitcase, it's a mindset of understanding what's going on around you. So with that, what last words would you like to share with our audience on anything that you think is really dear to you or important to be said?
What last words? At some point, maybe another time, I would love to talk about how the field that Evelyn, you're in, and I'm in, the psychology field, have been purveyors of some of the elements that has allowed this to happen. I think it's been underreported. And since we're insiders, I would love to be able to speak about that at some point.
And could you give us one example?
Sure. I had volunteered for many peace groups, Palestinian and Israeli peace groups, about 10 years ago. And what I would see common, this unscientific belief that the Israelis are Nazis because the Jews haven't dealt with the trauma from the Holocaust, and now they've become the perpetrators. You can still see that belief today. And I would see psychologists training other psychologists in these peace groups to pressure, an Israeli Jewish woman I witnessed. I can give you many examples, but this one stands out in particular. And she was living in Israel with the bombs and the missiles and everything from Hamas and Hezbollah coming, and she was frightened. And he kept pressuring her that her fear is irrational, that it's really because she hasn't resolved the Holocaust.
Wow.
That's a very, I hate to use the word good, but it's a very clear example of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So with that, we want to thank you for coming on the show. We really, really appreciate your insights. We thank our listeners for listening. I encourage everyone who hasn't seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, to see it. You can see it for free. One of the places is joinneveragainisnow.com. You can read more about my free Holocaust nonfiction play with the testimonies of both survivors and saviors, which I think is very important in today's day and age, to know we can all do something. We don't have to all be Oscar Schindler. That's at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And whenever you can, without getting yourself in physical danger, speak up against anti-Semitism and hate.